listening to Muslimish Freethinkers, a podcast dedicated to fostering conversations on matters of faith and disbelief.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this podcast. My name is Wissam Sharafuddin, and I'm interviewing today Dr. Hani Bawardi. Hani Bawardi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Dr. Hani Bawardi is one of the top experts on Arab immigration to the United States. He is an associate professor of history in the Department of Social Sciences and principal member of the Center of Arab American Studies at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. He is a member of the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts and the chairman of its academic committee. He is the author of The Making of Arab Americans, From Syrian Nationalism to U.S. Citizenship. Dr. Bawardi has amassed a sizable private collection of manuscripts and established oral history archives on Arab immigrants from the turn of the 19th century at the libraries of University of Michigan, Flint and Dearborn. Dr. Bawardi's private papers have the most complete documentation of the activities of four major immigrant political organizations prior to World War II, as well as the personal papers and letters of seminal thinkers and writers including Mikhail Naimy, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and their contemporaries in the U.S. currently. Dr. Bawardi is researching his next book on Arab American advocacy and organizations from 1951 to the present, and editing 2 Arabic language volumes in preparation for translating them. We would like to start our podcast, Doctor, with just a little personal introduction. So if you may give us just a brief bio about yourself before we dwell into the subject of your book.
I'd be glad to. I usually keep personal information away from my students to keep the classroom space safe for everyone. And I cannot snap out of that mindset, but I came to the States after high school from the Middle East in search of education. My priorities kind of shifted and, go through all the tribulations and turns and twists of adjusting to life in the States. But seeking college education is what brought me to the States. And I had gone through a stint in business ownership, like most immigrants in Flint, Michigan. But my heart was always set on some kind of academic degree. So I began initially researching business life and entrepreneurship among the early immigrants who are disproportionately represented in grocery retail in Flint. That was the gateway to all sorts of things, and ultimately what brought me here, I think.
So when you attempted to enter into academia, did you have a contemplation over different paths that you might take, and what were they?
Well, I grew up in a German school in the Middle East, although I was always smitten by literature and Arab culture, and exposed to German faculty. Nothing fancy, actually. You had to be poor to qualify to be in that school. So, but I was kind of drawn to metallurgy, something called Maschinenbau or tool and die, I guess. Wanted to attend General Motor Institute in Flint, but I couldn't get in. You had to be sponsored by GM. For that, you have to be a citizen or sponsored before you arrive to the States. So that didn't work. So I took all the technical classes in preparation for that. It didn't work, so I switched to political science. But then, like most members of my peers at the time, from relations, distant familial connections, drew me to business ownership, which is what happened by age 24. I owned my own business, the first one actually. But that thought never left me that I wanted to do something relating to academia. So it was like one thing after the other, sort of started on that path.
Then you went back to the political science program at this
Yes. One of those classes was taught by Neil Layton in Flint, Michigan, at the University of Michigan in Flint. And the subject was oral histories, and the company of older people was considered a rite of passage, something I liked and enjoyed. So I recorded a couple of narratives by older people, and I was immediately drawn to the experience of documenting the histories of people who have been in the States much longer than I have. I found that fascinating, and very soon began to sense that our lives in this country has been severed in two major groupings. The descendants of the very first arrivals, the pioneers, who came to this country in the 1880s, 90s, through the start of World War I. Their children, I interviewed a good number of the sons and daughters of those pioneers in Flint. And none of them are with us anymore, except maybe for one. So I'm glad I did that. But I sense a kind of disconnect between them and what I call in my master's thesis the intermediate generation, those who trickled into the country in the 1950s and 60s, very few of them. Those were kind of a bridge between the older generation or the survivors of the first wave of immigration and their descendants, and the influx of large numbers of college seekers, among them myself, who came after 1965. So what happened is that a quota system, basically a racist immigration scheme, was put in place and was enforced between roughly 1917. 1924 it became very prohibitive, immigration restrictions that is, which lasted all the way to 1965. So you have very few people who came from outside Northwestern Europe during that period, including Arabic-speaking people from the Levant and elsewhere. That's what makes the intermediate generation very unique. And then after 1965, the immigration restrictions were lifted, and many of us were able to come in on student visas or as part of family reunification. And the disconnect was even greater between the offspring of the very first comers and my peers, who were, most of them were drawn to business and did fairly well for themselves. So it was like a interaction between them was very limited, confined to maybe the church, or the intermediate generation played a good role in transmitting knowledge and especially a gateway into the stepping stone called grocery business. Beyond that, the old generation did not understand the young generation and viewed them with suspicion because they worked mostly in neglected neighborhoods, predominantly African American, and they didn't understand what happened to that space because in their days it was something totally different. And since then they moved on. Like the area where there was a little Syria in Flint, Michigan on Industrial Avenue became one of the most neglected areas in town. Whereas in the early 20th century, that was the hub of Syrian American life or Arab American life. Those folks refer to themselves as Syrians because they came from this geographic area called Syria, the Mount Lebanon area, the Shuf Mountains, Baqa, the Bekaa Valley, Palestine, Lebanon proper, and today's Lebanon and Syria proper. So that was like a way station for adjusting to American life, Little Syria on Industrial Avenue. But that changed completely. It disappeared entirely, became one of those neglected neighborhoods in Flint. And that's where you find black neighborhoods, that is, most of those merchants, young merchants, who did very well for themselves, but they were largely misunderstood. And that kind of bothered me, that the lack of transmittal of knowledge and, contiguity was missing from the get-go, mainly because of immigration restrictions, but also because of the passage of time and dynamic changes both here and overseas. Whereas we had a natural Syria comprised of actually Jordan, east of the Jordan River, historic Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria was one contiguous area. After 1965, after World War II, in fact. But by the time we arrived here, we came as nationalized Arabs from different countries, and we had less in common between ourselves and the previous generations. That, on top of that, we were, kind of 2 generations or 3 generations removed from the pioneers, operating in a completely new environment in Flint, Michigan, which itself has undergone dramatic changes, demographic and economic, etc. It's one of the most beleaguered cities in the country, as you know. Good people, resilient people, but you can withstand only so many layoffs by General Motors and
right. There's a documentary with Michael Moore, Roger and me.
Exactly. Actually, we knew Roger Moore fairly well.
Michael Moore.
I'm sorry. Roger Smith. Roger and Me is about Roger Smith, and Michael Moore is the filmmaker.
Right.
Yeah, Michael Moore was editor of the Flint Voice, and I knew him then, actually.
Mm-hmm. So when you entered into the program for political science, after a period of business ventures, did you enter into it with a passion, or was it just something that because you've started that earlier, you were resuming what you've started?
Yeah.
Was there a new intention? What you've described right now seems to give birth to a new intention.
Well, I didn't come with money. I never had the luxury of attending college with nothing else to worry about. So I had to work to support myself. So I opened the business even before I finished my bachelor's degree. So my passion was divided until the concerns of business consumed me almost completely. But what lingered is this phenomenon where members of my ethnic and national group were dramatically overrepresented in business ownership. We owned 104 out of 108 independent grocery outlets in Flint, Michigan. So I used to volunteer when I became financially stable, which happened in fairly short time once I opened my own business. I had enough time to volunteer for activism and all sorts of things at the time. One of those things is volunteering to lecture to school children about business. One of those lectures was about the effect of Arab culture on Spanish civilization. When it was time for questions and answers, a young pupil in elementary school, I think it was Northern Elementary on Mackin Road in Flint, he asked me, why do Arabs own grocery stores? Which was a poignant question, because 6 months later I found myself in Jerusalem on Mount Olive in the company of friends and relatives. And a complete stranger, a Palestinian there, asked me the same question. how come you guys own Storat? He said. He asked the question in Arabic, of course, but he used the Arabic corruption of the word stores in plural to inquire why we own so many. So I said, that's it. I think I'm onto something here. Maybe I can answer two questions at once.
Mm-hmm.
The divide between the generations, and why do we own so many grocery stores? 104 out of 108. Mm-hmm. So that became the topic of my master's thesis. And the gateway into the book you are proposing to talk about.
Right. We'll talk about how the idea of the book came to life. But before we enter into that subject, there's a small subject on the side that I'd like to bring it to our listeners' attention, and I'm sure it's a very common thought that goes in the minds of many Arab Americans, which is how rare is a specialization in political science or in general humanities in comparison to the medical field or technical specialties. Even within your own personal story, you've attempted a technical field before ending up in a humanities field. I understand as immigrants, we come with a survival mode sometimes to establish some sort of financial stability. Do you think that with the second generation now being a professor at University of Michigan, do you see that trend continuing? Is there still a lack of entering into humanities fields by Arab American students?
Well, yeah, we're definitely impoverished when it comes to the social sciences and the humanities. Young people understand they have to make a living. So they go for technical fields, business, pre-med, engineering, which seems to be like a more straightforward path to a steady job. And you can't blame them. But some of them underestimate how much talent and knowledge and basic skill they might bring to the field of the humanities and the social sciences. So it's really nice when we have someone who's excited about the study of history or sociology or art, let's say, things of that sort. Overall, yes, I think the trend is that I think family pressure plays a role in that. Families are not keen on history, per se.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually a personal choice that emanates out of a passion for the field. Given a choice, I think we'll have more young people in the humanities and the social sciences than we do otherwise had it not been for family pressure.
Do you feel it's a role of educating the parents, do you feel that this will change over time? I think they've immigrated, first generation immigrants, many of them immigrated with that survival mode, with that focus on financial independence, and many of them came and they have many mouths to feed, sometimes even supporting some family members in dire need back home. But then they have inherited or given that mindset to the newer generation, which does not have the same circumstances.
Yeah, it's true. I think with financial stability comes a little more freedom of, dabbling in different careers. I think you're right. The newcomers are keen on economic success. They want that for their children, and they want them to have opportunities they did not have. And those usually come with law or medicine or lawyer, doctor, business person. Seems to be a surer path to success. But as Arab Americans become more established, that anxiety subsides, so the young people can turn their attention to those neglected fields. Mm-hmm. And you can see evidence of that already. So there is increasing number of people who are beginning to see the value of writing their own stories into the discourses. Doing that on our terms without too much baggage from inherent in liberal education, and that's a subject we can actually dabble into maybe later on, pedagogy and those approaches. We're not there yet, frankly. So we have, I call Arab American Studies the 40-year-old infant, because the first studies we had came on the heels of this, openness and immigration, especially after the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, the June War of 1967. So out of the need to explain the Arab point of view, you had the start, the nucleus for what became known as Arab American Studies. But we did not do enough field work, translations. We don't have considerable repositories that are well organized and accessible. We have a few, not nearly enough. In fact, the Dean of Arab American Studies, Mikhail Naimy, wrote an article about this before his death. And he said that we dropped the ball. We haven't done enough. We did not.
And that's
establish.
due to the lack of students who are entering into that field.
You could say so. Yes. We overwhelmingly people tip towards those technical fields and law and business and etc.
And there's a price to pay. Correct. There's a price to pay for that lack of repositories and lack of research in our fields to represent the Arab American point of view.
I think so, but I think the community itself carries part of the burden. We have some collections here and there. To my knowledge, there is no one proficient enough in the language to understand what certain collections have, for example. And I visited a few. Some of them are completely uncharted territory and neglected. And I can tell you there's wealth of information there waiting to be excavated and catalogued and accessible by people who know what to do with it. So far we have, I am one of very few native Arabic speakers doing work on Arab American Studies. There's a fellow named Akram Khader in Chapel Hill. And I'm hard-pressed to think of another native speaker. There are young people who are attracted to the study of history and in the social sciences who are interested in Arab American study per se, but the numbers are few, and they're still in the process of making, cutting their academic teeth, so to speak.
So a final word on this subject. If you were to address a community regarding lifting the pressure of social students, our Arab American students going into humanities field, social sciences field, can you give that message?
Well, I'd say let your children follow their dreams, but it is a process. I think economic security is important to new immigrants. I know the feeling. It drove me for years. But in my case, I was fortunate enough to find an avenue for my interest.
Is it a myth that social sciences do not have a stable financial future?
I don't think so. I think if you like what you're doing enough and you contribute something original and valuable, there's a place for you in academia. But if you are a native speaker, not just resume Arabic, we have enough of those and not getting us anywhere in a hurry, to be honest with you. But if you have complete fluency in Arabic, working knowledge in standard Arabic, never mind, classical Arabic, just journalism Arabic. I can tell you, based on my experience in my own house, I have maybe half a dozen books written by the early pioneers, the peers of Khalil Gibran, for example, that need to be translated. Otherwise, Arab American, our knowledge of the formative period of Arabic immigration by Arabic speakers to this country will not move an inch unless those books are translated. Yet no one seems to see the value. Well, I shouldn't say no one, but very few institutions or scholars understand the value of that.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, can this be a basis for a university to make a decision to recruit foreign students to help in such need for research?
Well, I think the universities should pay attention to their hiring standards. Every Arabic or Middle Eastern Studies department in the country should have a native level speaker in it. Doesn't have to be an Arab, of course, but someone who can read Arabic with ease, has a working knowledge in the language enough to translate. We're far from that objective. In fact, the lack of support by the community itself, the extended community, and I'm talking about the established community, not the new immigrants, relatively new immigrants, that is, their lack of attention to this subject has turned, to use the words of Edward Said, he noted some time ago in the early 90s, late 80s, I heard him with my own ears telling us that, this lack of support is turning Middle Eastern Studies Department into, Turkish Studies Department, Armenian Studies, Judaic Studies, but not Arabic per se, like Middle Eastern with a focus on MENA region, for example. Mm. We have very few of those. So it's the community's task, people with means, but also institutions like educational organizations, universities, colleges need to pay attention to that. But I doubt they will unless the community learns to put forth expectations to that effect.
Mm-hmm. I just wonder, within the process of universities, if that is taken into consideration when considering the number of open applications to certain departments from certain countries. Is that taken into consideration?
Well, they'd love to have students, foreign students pay premium, so they would love to have them. Mm-hmm. But we have like a large number of Omani students at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. We have, of course, not to the extent of Chinese students in Ann Arbor, for example, but their orientation is not towards social sciences and literature. These are most likely to be drawn to engineering or sciences. Mm-hmm. So I think we have a good body of first-generation Arabic-speaking students that can be harnessed and their interest nurtured. And yes, I agree with you that the parents have a role to play.
Thank you, Doctor. I hope this message gets to the community about the importance of this role and the lack of participation in it. So I think that will have to do a lot with the next topic that we're going to be talking about, which is zooming in on your major project and accomplishment, truly, the making of Arab Americans from Syrian nationalism to U.S. citizenship, that encyclopedia really of Arabic immigration. I am studying this book, not only reading it and unpacking it, and I feel just how much effort did it take to put such a book together. I feel it's a summary of a huge journey, almost like the journey of Ibn Battuta, but within libraries and archives. Before we talk about it, how did the idea of the book come about?
Well, I think we kind of traced the beginning of that thread in the process of investigating, just to explain part of my own experience, how so many Arabs were drawn to business. I began to interview merchants. I wanted to find the person who started this entire, what is called patron-client relationship, that chain link of grocery retail that lasted 120 years in Flint. And my search took me to the home of a kind soul named Amin Roy Rushd. Roy Farah. Roy's dad is named Amin Farah. And Amin Farah is the one who came from Nazareth and responsible for a continuous chain link migration from Nazareth that lasted until the 1990s, which resulted in a predominance of that clan in the grocery business. Because he brought a very important merchant who became very successful named Subhi Farah, or Uncle Sam, who facilitated ownership of grocery stores by scores of people, who himself made available the same opportunities to George Farah, who is the reason why I dabbled in the business. But that search actually took me to the basement of Roy Farah, who told me, my father Amin left me those boxes. I don't know what to do with them. Why don't you take a look? And I looked, and I said, this is really important, interesting stuff. I saw some pictures, some documents.
Did Roy still speak Arabic or
No.
write Arabic?
No.
So they were foreign to him.
Yeah, he was born in this country. His father, Amin, was born in 1888 in Nazareth, in northern Palestine. And Roy Farah said, why don't you take them? I don't know what to do with them. So I took those papers home. I began to look at them, and I literally did not sleep that night. I was up until daybreak, looking through the papers, and I could not actually absorb the enormity of those documents. I knew instinctively that this will be time-consuming and very important. So I finished my master's thesis, and then I began to turn my attention to those documents. And I figured immediately that it will take me 3-4 years to really absorb the material. We are talking about manuscripts, letters, pamphlets, books, and official letters of those organizations that were, haranguing for natural Syria to become an independent country. And I knew enough to know that we're talking about the genesis of Arab national movement there, or what is called a Nahda, Arab awakening. The latter part of a Nahda was decidedly political. So I enrolled in the doctorate program. So my master's, to be honest with you, was more like a hobby than anything else. Although it's a work I'm proud of also. It's a considerable amount of work. So I enrolled in the doctorate program, and I heard through my mentor for the master's, bless her soul, Nora Fairs, that there's the best immigration historian, one of the best in the country, John Bukovchik, is at Wayne State. I should work with him. And that's exactly what I did. And began to write my dissertation after a couple of years, 3 years or so. And that was actually the start of this arduous journey of, or enjoyable, tortuous process of, cataloging and understanding the dense material.
So take us through this journey, because not all of us come from academic backgrounds. We don't know exactly, when you talk about this process, what does it mean? So you took this box. What comes next? Now you wanna start using these documents. How does this process come together? What's the academic steps that are needed?
Well, at the time I was hardly an academic. I had a very strong, engineering/business/ master's thesis, which was really sociological in its nature. So yes, I was being introduced to academia, in fact. What I did was that during my stint at Wayne State, I did a certificate in archival management, archival preservation and record management. That was very helpful. So
just to deal with these documents?
I think so. I think that was really in the back of my mind. So that gave me the tools to, first of all, preserve them, make sure...
How much effort is that? Was it a course, or was it a
series of courses?
Series of courses.
Yeah. it could have gotten out of hand into another master's, but I didn't want to go that far. So certificate sufficed. Philip Mason was at Wayne State, who's a formidable talent himself. But I arrested any decay to the papers. Roy, who gave me the papers, did a wonderful job preserving them. His basement was actually dry and almost archival. Low humidity, low temperature. Because he also kept a sizable number of children's books, which was his son's passion, who is one of the authorities on the subject. So it was a very, very lucky chance. So I vacated a room in my basement, put a powerful dehumidifier, and made sure it's always cool and very dry and very safe, away from insects, away from fire, away from water for sure. And I removed carefully wherever I saw Scotch tape, although there wasn't much of that, because that's corrosive. I removed rubber bands. I actually left the iron pins from the period in place because the iron was very stable. It becomes like almost naturally stable. It has this black patina and it does not rust anymore. The damage has done, so I left those because I guess I found out I'm a collector. I collected even the pens, kept them there. So, but no more damage. And I began to catalog them. So going through them, I found out that there is like family correspondences between Amin and his father, who is the archpriest of the Orthodox community in Nazareth. The man is a historian in his own right and an accomplished author with impeccable handwriting. Put those in a category. I found a series of some 37 letters, which are among the most important papers, although I can say that about every page in the collection, to be honest with you. But I found, for example, correspondence between Amin Farah and two childhood friends, a guy named Nicholas or Nuhula Obain, who was in Montpellier, France. Gibran Kuzma was in Montpellier, France, who turned out to be a very important activist in Palestine. And Gibran Kuzma was in Montpellier, France, and Nicholas or Nuhula Obain was in Egypt. And between them, they hatched a plan to create a secret anti-Ottoman society seeking independence of Syria. What they didn't tell us in the papers, which are actually, they kept out all references to names or cities in order to be secret.
And these were with Amin Farah?
Yes.
Documents?
Yes.
Why did they end up there with Amin
That's
Farah?
a really good question, because some are addressed between Kuzma and Kobain, not intended for Amin. It seems like he collected them. He spent 1 year in Alexandria after he escaped from the Ottoman conscription in Egypt, where he taught for a school for Jewish children before he came to the States. So most of the correspondence took place while he was there, and some correspondence followed him to the United States, but that was in 1913. So in 1914, World War I started, so the correspondence kind of was interrupted and resumed in 1919 after the war.
What year did Amin Farah come to the United States?
14, I'm sorry. So he escaped to Egypt, I think 1912 or so. While he's in Egypt, and this is pretty significant, he joined two organizations. One I can document, the other one is so secretive that we don't know its members to this day. But the organization itself is very well known in Arab history. So the first one that is well known is اللجنة الإدارية اللجنة اللامركزية العثمانية, or the Ottoman Decentralization Committee. That was headed by a big nationalist called Rafiq Azam. And the other secret organization he joined is al-Arabi al-Fatat, or the young Arab. This one is well known to scholars, but to this day we don't know all its members. What happened is that they copied the bylaws and the objectives of the Young Arab secret organization, which actually sought complete independence of Syria within its geographic boundaries. And they were very specific about that. From the Taurus Mountains in the north, that's the borders between Syria and Turkey, to the Sinai and the Arabian Desert in the south and southeast, and from the Mediterranean in the west to roughly the Euphrates in the east, or the Syrian desert at least. That became the basis for what I disclose in the book, one of the first known Arab immigrant formal political organizations, the Free Syria Society. So I collected all those papers and put them in one file. But those correspondences was the first cue that challenges, Western discourse. For example, that those immigrants or Arabs in general in that region did not possess a sense of self as a people. They still say that. They argue that that happened only after the Western occupation, or what is called the Mandate, or at least after World War I, when they came and brought with them institutions per se.
Right. This doctor will enter us into a subject. I know that you are an expert in the Arab American identity, but before we get into that, we are going to speak about the Arab identity.
Okay.
But we are running out of time for this episode, so this will be for the next episode. But wrapping up this episode, I have a few questions about the archival process. So, Roy introduced you to Amin Farah's depository documents, and Amin Farah, being a very interesting personality himself, who has left Palestine. He was imprisoned by the Ottomans. He went to Egypt. He is involved in several organizations, and then he immigrated to the United States in 1914. And he continues a very active history afterwards, which he will talk to us more about. So you basically found a treasure in Roy's basement.
Yes.
I have a hypothetical question. What would have happened if Roy never met you?
I hate to even contemplate what would have happened, because just a small clarification. Amin Farah was not imprisoned by the Ottomans, but they conscripted him into the army.
Oh, okay.
So after 1908, Christians can be drafted into the Ottoman army to fight in the Balkan Wars later on, which meant certain death. So he escaped to Egypt, to Alexandria. But I am aware of two collections that were lost to neglect, completely gone. One belonging to one of Amin's contemporaries, who came to Flint in 1920, and others, of course, elsewhere. When Roy died, his son called me, only because he knew of my interest in the papers, and he gave me some additional artifacts and pictures. Had he not known anything about me, I doubt there would have been a concerted effort to place those documents in a place where they can be accessible to scholars. And this is exactly what I mean by the community's responsibility to create those repositories, and to make sure that there is someone knowledgeable enough, versed in the Arabic language at least, to look after them. So we had that at the Library of Congress, for example, or the New York Public Library, but we never made an effort to deposit papers there per se.
Do public libraries accept today repositories if someone is depositing documents to them?
I don't think so. Those two places are unique because they have large capacity for, preserving things, and they do have some impressive holdings. but most libraries don't have the place or
So
the
do
space.
you think, as we speak right now, there are many houses that have boxes of papers in their basements that might be very valuable to our history?
Most certainly there are. New York, we haven't even tapped into New York, which was the destination for most of the early immigrants. How many of them still have that chest they brought with them, or what used to be called the kishe, from which they peddled their wares, as door-to-door peddlers? It did not last very long. But I know some families who still have the same box that came with them.
What would you tell them?
Keep them somewhere safe and just wait until there is a place you can deposit them and take them to. Every snippet of paper, every page is valuable. There was a lady in Ann Arbor I met by chance who happened to have a large collection, including letters from a fellow named Mikhail Naimy, and I do have some of his papers, as a matter of fact, letters by him. And this man is a large, towering literary figure in Arab literature. And she didn't know exactly what she had, but she knew that she had these papers of a great uncle of hers, and he is represented in my collection. So I was able to tell her about who he was. And luckily, I think she gave those papers to the Arab American National Museum. The question becomes, what became of them?
Right.
Is there someone there that can catalog them, understand them, and make them available or not? That is a question I don't have the answer to.
Thank you, Dr. Bawardi. I think we have a very important two messages from this podcast for our communities. Number one, of course, there's many messages, but the two that I want to highlight and emphasize their importance is that, number one, please encourage our children who have a passion towards history and social sciences, humanities, to pursue their passions. They will achieve financial stability in whatever they excel in, and it's much needed, and the value of it is much larger than creating an additional financial success or a cushion of financial comfort. And number two is, if you have any documents, whether you understand their importance or not, that you have inherited or brought back home, or they carry some sort of historical weight to them, please preserve them. Seek help from professionals if you need some tips on how to preserve them. I think Dr. Bawardi shared some of these tips. Until they are needed one day, they might be needed soon. So please, these two messages are very important messages that we want to come out from this episode. We will continue as long as Dr. Bawardi is available to sit with us, hopefully.
With pleasure.
To continue this beautiful journey of how our history, our early history as Arab Americans, have been rediscovered. Any final words, Doctor?
Well, looking forward to the next time, I guess.
Thank you, and have a great
Thank you for listening to Muslimish Freethinkers. Do let us know what you think of this episode at facebook.com/Muslimish. Don't forget to visit us at muslimish.org.